The summer I turned 17, my family decided to escape the city for a while. My dad had inherited a small cabin in northern New Mexico from his uncle, a grizzled old man who lived off the grid until he vanished a few years back. No one knew what happened to Uncle Ray, and just that one day, he was gone, leaving behind a shack in the woods and a stack of journals no one bothered to read. Dad figured it'd be a cheap vacation, a chance to reconnect with nature. Mom wasn't thrilled, but she went along with it. My little sister Ellie was just excited to chase some rabbits, and me, I didn't care either way. I brought my sketchbook and figured I'd draw the trees or something to kill some time. The cabin sat about 20 miles outside of a dusty little town called Tre Crew, surrounded by scrubland and cottonwood groves that stretched toward the horizon. It was small, weathered, and had logs stained dark by decades of sun and wind, a sagging porch, and windows so cloudy that they looked like cataracts. The air smelled of sage and dry earth, and at night the silence was so thick it felt like a weight on your chest. No neighbors for miles, just us, the wind, and the occasional coyote howl. The first few days were uneventful. Dad tinkered with his generator, Mom read her novels, and Ellie ran around collecting rocks. I'd sit on the porch with my sketchbook, drawing the gnarled cottonwoods that lined the property. The branches twisted like skeletal hands, and something about them made my pencil linger longer than it should have. I'd sketch their shadows stretching across the dirt. The way they seemed to shift even when the wind was still. It was hypnotic in a way. On the fourth night, things got weird. I woke up to a sound like a low guttural hum coming from outside. It wasn't mechanical, not like the generator or a car engine. It was something alive. I laid there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, trying to place it. The hum grew louder, then stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under something heavy. I sat up, heart thudding, and glanced at Ellie's sleeping bag across the room. She was still out, her chest rising and falling softly. The clock on the wall said 2:47 a.m. I crept to the window and peeled back the curtain. Moonlight bathed the yard in silver, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying slightly, though I couldn't feel a breeze through the cracked window pane. Then I saw it, a shape moving between the trunks, tall, hunched, and too thin to be human. It didn't walk so much as it lurched, its limbs bending at odd angles like a marionette with half its strings out. I froze, with a breath caught in my throat, watching as it slipped out of sight behind the trees. I told myself it was a deer or a trick of the light, but my hands shook as I crawled back to my sleeping bag, and I did not sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my family. My dad would have laughed, Mom would have worried, and Ellie would have just asked a million questions. Instead, I went outside after breakfast to look around. The dirt near the cottonwoods was dry and cracked, but I found something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. Not deer tracks, not coyote paws, but human feet, and barefoot, pressed deep into the ground. Too deep, like whatever made them weighed more than it should have. They trailed from the trees toward the cabin, stopping about 20 feet from the porch. I followed them back the other way into the grove until they just vanished. No scuff marks, no sign of turn, just gone. That night, the humming came again. This time, Ellie heard it too. She sat up, rubbing her eyes and whispering, "What's that?" I told her it was probably the wind, but my voice cracked, and she did not buy it. We sat there listening as the sounds grew closer, then faded into that same sharp crack. I didn't look out the window this time. I didn't want to. By the third night, I couldn't pretend it was nothing. I'd spent the day digging around the cabin, looking for anything Uncle Ray might have left behind that could explain this. In a dusty trunk under the bed, I found his journals. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather with pages yellowed and curling. I flipped through one dated 5 years back. Most of it was mundane, notes about the weather, sketches of plants, and rants about trespassers. But near the end, the tone shifted, and the handwriting got shaky with words that were frenetic. "It's watching me," he wrote. "Comes at night, stands in the trees. Not a man, not an animal, something else. It knows I see it. Last night it called my name. My voice, but not mine. I locked the door, but I hear it scratching. God help me, I hear it scratching." The next entry was worse. I made a mistake. Went too close to the old well. Saw its face, eyes like holes, skin stretched wrong. It smiled at me. I ran, but it followed. It's fast. Too fast. I don't think it's human anymore. Maybe it never was. The last page was just one line, scrawled so hard the pen tore through. "Don't listen when it speaks." I shoved the journal back into my trunk, my mouth dry. Uncle Ray had always been a loner, a little unhinged. Everyone said he'd probably wandered off and died in the desert, but now I wasn't so sure. That night, it wasn't just humming. It was a voice. "Jake," it called, low and raspy, dragging my name out like a snake slithering through gravel. I bolted upright, sweat beading on my forehead. Ellie whimpered, clutching her pillow. The voice came again, louder and closer. "Jake, come out." It sounded like Dad, but Dad was snoring in the next room. I could hear him through the thin walls. I grabbed Ellie's hand and pulled her to the floor, whispering for her to stay quiet. The voice kept going, circling the cabin, sometimes sounding like Dad, sometimes like Mom, once even like Ellie herself, giggling in a way that made my skin crawl. Between the calls there were footsteps, heavy and uneven, pacing just outside the walls. Then the scratching started, slow, intentional, like nails dragging across wood. I don't know how long it went on. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. Eventually it stopped. The silence was worse somehow. Ellie cried quietly into my shoulder, and I just stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. It didn't. The next morning, Dad found the scratches, deep gouges into the logs, too high for a bear, too precise for claws. He muttered something about vandals and grabbed his rifle, saying he'd take care of it if they came back. Mom looked pale, but didn't argue. I wanted to tell them about the journals, the voice, the thing in the trees, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? That day, I went back to the journals. One entry mentioned an old well a half-mile west of the cabin. It was near a dried-up creek bed. Uncle Ray had mentioned about it obsessively, calling it their place and the source. I didn't know what he meant, but I had to see it. If there was an answer, it would be there. I waited until afternoon when Dad was napping and Mom was distracted with Ellie. I grabbed a flashlight, a kitchen knife, and my sketchbook. Like that'd do anything, and I headed west. The cottonwoods thickened as I went, their roots snaking on the ground. The air grew colder, heavier, like I was walking into a fog that I couldn't see. After 20 minutes, I found it. A crumbling stone well, half collapsed, surrounded by a ring of dead grass. The creek bed was nearby, just a shallow trench of cracked earth. I peered into the well. It was dark, the bottom lost in shadow. There was a faint smell that wafted up, rotten, metallic, like old blood. I stepped back. My shoe crunched on something brittle. Bones, small ones, scattered around the well. Rabbits, birds, maybe a fox. Some were fresh, still slick with bits of flesh. And that's when I heard a low chuckle echoing from the trees. I spun around, knife trembling in my hand. Nothing. Just the cottonwoods swaying silently. Then the voice again, soft and close. Jake. It wasn't Dad's voice this time. It was mine. I ran, branches snagging at my clothes, roots tripping me, but I didn't stop until I was back at that cabin, gasping, the knife still clutched in my fist. And Dad was awake, yelling about where I'd been, but I couldn't answer. I just locked myself in the bedroom and waited for night. It came back, of course, louder and angrier. The voice switched between all of us. Dad, Mom, Ellie, me, screaming, laughing, begging. The scratching turned to pounding. It was shaking the walls, and that's when Dad grabbed his rifle and stormed outside. He shouted into the dark, and we heard a shot. Then silence. Mom screamed for him to come back. He did, but he was pale and shaking, muttering something about moving too fast. The next day, we packed up. No one argued. We left the cabin behind, the journals, the well, all of it. On the drive out, I looked back and I saw it, just for a second, standing at the edge of the cottonwoods. Tall, thin, with its head cocked at an impossible angle. It raised a hand, waving slowly, its mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't quite a grin. We never went back. Dad sold the cabin a year later to some guy who didn't ask questions. I don't know if he ever saw it, and I don't care. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. Not loud, not close. Just a whisper through the window, calling my name in its own voice. I don't answer. I never will. Because Uncle Ray was right. You don't listen when it speaks.